My name is Juliana Nykolaiszyn with the Oklahoma State University Library. Today is Friday, January 18th, 2013, and we're in Stillwater, Oklahoma, interviewing Dr. Donald J. Banks as part of the O State Stories Oral History Project. Thank you so much for joining me today.
You're welcome.
Well, let's learn a little bit more about you. Could we start by having you tell us the year you were born?
1930.
All right, now give us a little background on where you were born in your early life.
I was born in the town of Sentinel, Oklahoma, but lived on a farm about 6 miles to the northwest of Sentinel. It was 160 acres, and we rented that farm from my grandfather. I grew up in that rural community, attended school at what was at the time the largest consolidated country school in Oklahoma and perhaps west of the Mississippi. I don't recall the exact population of the school, but it was a large school. Many buses ran to pick up the students. It was a conservative type school. The teachers were magnificent people, had great family values. We were taught on that kind of a situation. Started at school in 1936. Just before I had started the school, I was a victim of an accident whereby a neighbor friend of mine, not meaning to, tossed a brick which landed on my head. I was unconscious for a period of time. When I woke up, I couldn't speak clearly. My parents drove me to the hospital in town. The doctor examined me, and I don't know the circumstances, but he got on the telephone, obviously, and called for a neurosurgeon. At that time, they called him just a brain specialist. And he flew to the area of Sentinel in a private plane. I don't know the details on how he did that, but he examined me and performed surgery on my skull and a portion of my brain. A part of the brain membrane covering had been torn. He sewed me up. He left either that evening or the next day. I never saw him again. I survived that operation, and in 2 weeks I enrolled in school at Port Consolidated Country School in the first grade.
How old were you when you had
I was 6 years old.
with the injury?
Yes. A little bit more on the history. I don't know what the cost was for the surgery, but my parents worked out some arrangement to pay that cost. When I enrolled in school, my hair had not grown quite back to full length, and I noticed the kids kind of staring at me because I looked a little different than they did, because my head had been, the whole head had been shaven. But mind you, this was in the time without modern antibiotics, and any operation was a possible infection situation. But I survived that, and I thank God for the service of the doctor who performed that operation, Dr. Harry Wilkins. I never met him again, but just recently, my grandson, Jacob Longan, arranged for family members of Dr. Wilkins, his daughter, and my family to have a reunion in Oklahoma City at the OU Medical Foundation. The accident did not, I wasn't incapacitated except for that brief recovery period. I don't know where else I should go on this except we picked up a lot of good values in this Port Consolidated Country School. We were members of most of us were members of the 4-H club, and we participated in farm activities, growing of pigs and general livestock farming and things of that sort. Our farm happened to be one we grew mainly wheat, generally about 100 acres of wheat, but we also grew some barley and grain of sorghum and those general crops. Cotton, always grew some cotton. Cotton was a good cash crop. It came off late in the fall and early winter, and that was, you could buy some Christmas gifts at that time of the year.
Would you have to help pick the cotton?
Oh yeah, in Oklahoma we pulled the cotton. The whole burr containing the cotton was, we had a sack, a canvas type sack that we pulled behind us with a strap over the shoulder, and generally the customary was to pull 2 rows because you went through the open center. If you could do so, you might even pull 3 rows or 4 rows, but 2 was it. And if it was a good cotton crop, it took quite a little bit of effort to harvest those burrs.
What were some of your other farm chores?
Of course, all of the kids on the farms, they generally grew or raised livestock, beef animals, dairy animals, hogs, chickens, turkeys, and things of that sort. We had fairly large gardens, so we were self-sufficient in a great degree. We would take the eggs and either the milk or the cream. We had a cream separator that would separate the cream from the milk. And generally on a Saturday and Saturday afternoon is when most of the people would go to town to carry their produce. That's the eggs and the cream. And you would get a check as soon as they processed that, and that gave my mom money to buy the staple materials that she needed, like the flour, sugar, things of that nature. But vegetables and fruits, much of that we grew ourselves.
Well, you mentioned your mother, but could you go back and tell me a little bit about your parents?
Yes, I don't recall the year that they married, but my dad was a veteran of World War I. He was served in the Navy, and he didn't see any action because most of the action was on the ground, but I do know that he was stationed in France for a period of time. He was proud of his military service, and we have several photographs of him in his military uniform. His brother also, older brother, served in the Navy. Dad and Mom married and immediately became farmers. My mom's grandparents at the time I was born lived in Hobart, Oklahoma. My dad's parents lived in Oklahoma City at the time. Both sets of grandparents were great people. We enjoyed, my brother and I haven't mentioned him, but he was 5 years older than me, so he was much senior to me. My parents had a younger child, well, it'd be older to Jess and I, that died of dysentery as a child. And so he was the first victim, or first deceased one, and they bought a plot in the Sentinel Cemetery, and that's where he was buried. In the same year that I'd suffered my skull and brain injury, my dad was killed in an accident in October of that year.
Your injury was in July.
You haven't. My injury was on July the
27th.
July 27th, and in October, my dad was killed in an accident. That left Mom and my older brother Jess. He was 11 at the time. I was 6 at the time. And I don't understand how Mom, having lost not too long ago a son, and then the injury that I had, and then my father's death, I don't know how she coped with that. But she was a strong woman, and we survived. I graduated not at Port because we moved to Sentinel, the town, quit farming and moved to Sentinel. So I actually graduated from Sentinel High School rather than Port.
Why'd you move to town?
Well, we were going to give up farming, and my mother did marry, remarried, and it happened to be to the rural mail carrier. Everybody knew everyone in that small community. The marriage didn't work out, but we moved after she married. I finished out my junior year at Port School. They allowed me to do that, and I had the opportunity to continue at Port School if I wanted to. They said, the superintendent said there would be no problem in doing that. But the superintendent said I couldn't participate in any of the sports where you play different teams, from different schools. That was the rule back then. Not that I was all that great in sports, but I wanted to participate. I enjoyed baseball and basketball and some track, and I elected to graduate at Sentinel. That was, to me, that was a good thing, because Sentinel, being a town made up mainly of some rural folks, but many of the students were from the town. It was a little more liberal type situation. They weren't as conservative as, and that opened my eyes to the fact that it's a different group of students. It also gave me, you could substitute journalism for your last year of English instead of taking English. And I elected to take the journalism course. And it had been the first time in many years we put out an annual for the school, which included the grade schools and all that. The journalism class also produced a paper, Sentinel High Times is called, of the school activities. It came out every 2 weeks. And we were required to do the whole thing. We didn't print it. We had the local printer do that. But we wrote the stories, and did the management, and sold ads and subscriptions and all that sort of stuff. And I happened to be selected, and I don't know, it was a vote early on the annual to be editor-in-chief. I didn't do any more work than anybody else, but it was a good experience, journalism. It helped me develop some writing ability. And also, something that I'm real excited about is I get to go to both school reunions. And the Sentinel reunion comes up every 5 years. The Port reunion comes up every 3 years. And this year, it will be the Port reunion. So on Labor Day weekend, I will get to go to a reunion. My Port class had about about 20 students that graduated, and at the last reunion I think there were 6, maybe 7 students who attended. Many are deceased. Some moved out of the state and we never heard from them again, so I don't know if they live or not.
Well, going back to your time growing up, did you notice a lot? I mean, we're in the middle of the Depression and the Dust Bowl. Was there a lot of dust blowing through town?
Oh, yes. I can remember vividly the dust clouds that would come through from time to time. I can remember one event that where my brother had stayed at school for some reason or other, and we drove in to pick him up. He stayed for basketball practice or something. We went in, and we were driving. The wind was blowing real strong, and the dust, the sand particles. And I noticed an instance of where there was a fence post as we went in that had a spot on it that was glowing red like a growing ember. Now, I can't say for sure that the dust did that, but there wasn't anything else that could have in my mind. That seems strange, but wind can carry dust that can concentrate in an area, and apparently there was enough peppering of the sand particles to start that. It wasn't blazing, it was just glowing in a red glow. That's unusual. As far as the situation, my parents realized we were in a depression area. I didn't know, being young, I didn't know. I thought that was just a common situation. I do know that we were very conservative on money. We wanted a lot of things and a lot of toys, but we couldn't have them. and we accepted that. A lot of toys we made ourselves. The games we played were simple games. I still know how to play a boy's game with a pocket knife that's root the peg or mumble peg, and you score the way the blades of the knife hit and the way they stand. We hunted and fished a lot, and it was a sport, but Mom was always grateful when we brought back a rabbit or a duck. We didn't have many squirrels, so we didn't get much into squirrels, but that was a good sport, and it added to the meat on the table. Prices were cheap. As a kid, kids like ice cream. You could get for a while we had a ice cream parlor that sold malts and ice cream cones. They had a cone that was shaped to where it would hold 2 dips, and there were big dips of ice cream, and they would set another dip up on the top for a nickel. 3 dips for a nickel. Candy bars were a nickel. Soda pop, as we call it, was a nickel. You could go to the show, the movie, for 10 cents. Popcorn was a nickel. If Mom gave me a quarter, that was a lot of money, because I could go to the picture show. I probably wouldn't take the popcorn and the drink, but I would have 15 cents to spend, and I could buy an ice cream cone, and then I could have 10 cents to buy some toy, which was
a real treat.
A real treat.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I was big into always buying a gun. I liked a pistol, and I had a lot of those. Those were the old cap pistols, where on some of them were just a single shot. You had to pinch the cap off and put it in there and cock it and fire it. Some were multiple shooting. You put the whole roll in there, and it had a mechanism that advanced in that. Sometimes they fire, and sometimes they wouldn't. But we played games like tin can shinny, and that's pretty descriptive, because you used a stick as a club and used a tin can, and those tin cans were not made out of aluminum. You had a hole in front of your position. It was the game was played in a circle, and the object was to get the can in the other guy's hole that was out in front of him. And when you did that, he was out of the game, and you finally eliminated it to where it was just 2 people. We played a lot of marbles. There was a game called marbles and you had to use your forefinger and your thumb to flip that marble, and there were 3 styles of that game. There was the big bullseye, which was a scribed circle on the ground as much as 5 feet or so across. And in that game, the yakes or dakes were put in. Each player would put a marble in the game, and the object was to knock the marbles that were in the center out into the outside. And if you played for keeps, that meant you got to keep the marbles that you knocked out. You couldn't. You used a taw, what we called a taw, and it was generally a little bigger marble to knock those out. In the game of bullseye, you had to hit a glancing blow, and your taw had to go outside of the ring. If it stayed inside the ring, it wasn't a good shot. You lost your turn. There was another game which was done in a square, a rectangle about 10 inches apart on the parallel lines. It had a different set of rules, and then there was the so-called cat's eye, shaped like an eye, tear dropped on each side, and however many yakes or dakes you put in there. In order to determine who got to shoot first, you lagged for position of shooting. The lag line was some 10 feet away from where you were playing, and whoever got closest to the lag line got to shoot first, and your order was figured in. So if you lagged and got to shoot first, you might be able to capture more marbles than anybody else. There was all kinds of little extra things. Kiss, tie, gimme, go, which meant if I kiss your marble, hit your marble, or tie with your marble, I get the advantage. Kind of a strange statement, but that's the way it was. But those, once you had your marbles, you didn't, you could play games forever if you didn't play for keeps. And during school, we had the break. The school bell rang, and we'd get to go out for, I think it was, I'm not sure, 10 minutes, I think. It might have been 15 minutes, but I think about 10 minutes. So we could go out and play in the schoolyard on good days and do the games of our choice, marbles or mumble peg, or we could swing on the monkey bars and stuff like that. They did have a small set of the recreational stuff, and merry-go-rounds and seesaws.
Would Port School have a Christmas program?
They not every year. On occasion they would have, but not every year. I do remember there was a tragic fire that took place at the Babs, they call it the Babs Switch School. Mom knew about that and told my brother and I about that. It took place when at that little school, they call it the Bab Switch because that was where the train switched tracks. That's where the switch part came in. But there was a big Christmas program, and they used cedar tree and it was conducive, and they had lit candles on the tree, and by some accident the tree caught fire, and many of the students were killed as a result of that fire. It's a great tragedy. In recent years, they have put on the courthouse area at Hobart a large map of Kiowa County, And that map, was drawn by an artist on ceramic tile, and the tile is laid out, and you can look. It's a magnificent thing. It shows everything about Kiowa County, the towns, the schools, the Indian missions, the lakes, the creeks, and all of that, and anything that was historic. And if you look for it, the Babs school is shown, and it's marked tragic fire. So it's a history. Every county in Oklahoma ought to have something like that.
Well, going back to your education, was education important in your family?
Oh yes, we had the parents were real supportive of the grade in the high school, of course, and the teachers were admired. The parents supported the teachers. The teacher was right. They wouldn't argue about, oh, you're picking on my son or daughter. They would be supportive of, hey, they need discipline. And discipline was by not switch, but by the board. The superintendent of the school, J.M. Welch, would say, I will apply the Board of Education. And he meant it.
Did you ever have any run-ins with the board?
There was one time, and it was not of my, this is kind of a strange story, but I was innocent of what happened, but you know, I didn't tell Mom that I got spanked, I guess you'd say.
What did you do?
Well,
or didn't?
There was a small store adjacent to the school that served hamburgers and soft drinks and candy bars and all that kind of stuff. That's before the Lunchroom program came in. And we would go down there and get a hamburger and all that. Hamburgers a nickel a piece. And, but we didn't always go down there because most of the time Mom would fix lunch, you know, and you'd carry your lunch either in a pail or wrapped up in a sack or something like that. So you didn't go down there every day because you couldn't afford it. But a friend of mine and I, and I'll say his name because I'll mention him later anyway. Bill Tom Leonard and I we'd been down there and we were going back, and a couple of girls in our class were in front of us, and I don't know what provoked Bill Tom to say this, but he says, "Hey girls, wait on us and we'll come and kiss you," or something like that, just being ornery, you know. Well, I didn't think anything about it. I wasn't even involved in the conversation. But when we got back to school, and about, I don't know, the middle of the afternoon, we were summoned to the superintendent's office. And we didn't know what the situation was. And the girls, and I remember at least one of the girls, I won't hold this against her, but they told the story that we had, well, maybe Bill Tom said this. Maybe he said, "Hey, I'll trade you a gumdrop for a kiss," or something like that. But anyway, the superintendent says, "I understand you've been trading gumdrops for kisses." And that didn't even ring a bell with me because I didn't remember what he said. But he decided that we needed punishment. we denied it, but we got about 5 licks with his Board of Education. I never told Mom about that. Anytime you got discipline at school, if your parents heard about it, you got disciplined, even more so at home. Standards were high. We often had a little prayer in school before the school started. We always had the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. And so patriotism was a part of it. The war came along, and I don't know if this is at this time to talk about that, but the war came along, and it united America for that particular effort. Back to school, the standards were pretty high. I remember in the grades, even up to, we started at the first grade. They used to call it primary and then first grade, but when I was there, it was just, during my time, it was first grade on up to 8th grade. And the 7th, 8th, and 9th grades were considered junior high. Well, could participate in junior high activities, sports. And then the 9th, 10th, and the 9th was the freshman year. If you were good athletically, you could play on the, as a freshman, you could play on the high school team or the junior high team. But that was the situation. I was amazed at the complete difference in attitude of the superintendent and the principal. We also had a principal of the school. That discipline was pretty rendered pretty often down in the grades, but in high school it was very lax. They thought, well, you had arrived at a position in life that you are allowed more freedom, and I guess that was part of their educational system.
Well, when you're in high school, do you have any idea of what you want to be when you get older?
Well, yeah, I decided, and this is what I took first year of college. I was kind of fascinated with radio, and there were people who became radio announcers in those days. They would announce what the program was going to be, the next program, and so on and so forth. And I enjoyed speaking and that, and I thought that's what I wanted to be. It was a radio announcer. There wasn't a whole lot of positions for that, but I kind of liked that. So that's what, when I got to college, that's what I first enrolled in. I also enjoyed dramatics in particularly at Port. Each year they would have a junior, those that were juniors in high school, a junior play, and they'd also have a senior play, and they'd have a all high school play, and I participated in those plays. I was fortunate to have been picked. I guess it was my junior year to be in the all high school play. think I was the only one from my class to do that. And I've got a little medal that they awarded me, the dramatic award for that year, because I participated in the senior play and the all high school play.
Well, how did you decide where to go to college?
Well, there were a lot of times when we knew about the college. I guess maybe the first maybe inklings of that was when we were in the 4-H club. We had a county agent that would come around, and incidentally, he was the county agent for the farmers, as well as he was the one who ran and formed the 4-H clubs. One man in the county that did that. They also had a lady in the county who was the home demonstration agent. But we had a very effective and large 4-H club, and we knew he had been educated at Oklahoma A&M College. He was employed by the college as a part of the extension program, and so we heard of Oklahoma A&M that way. Also, I remember that my brother got interested in judging poultry and became quite good at that, and he won the county poultry judging contest, and the county agent formed a Ouachita County poultry judging team, including my brother and 2 other fellows that were in the county, to participate in the Oklahoma State poultry judging contest, and they won that contest. That gave them the ability to represent Oklahoma at the National 4-H Club Congress, which met in Chicago. And I specifically remember that the county agent took the Ouachita County poultry judging team to Oklahoma A&M College for a day or two to get training from the poultry specialist here. And so that's another way that I knew about Oklahoma A&M College. There are many other ways. A lot of it was like in the paper. You'd hear about events that were taking place at A&M, track events. I remember Bob Fenimore being an outstanding runner in football. See his picture in the Daily Oklahoman. Others, Ralph Tate and the trackster, and the basketball team. We'd get that information. There's also in the paper information on the Oklahoma Flying Farmers. These were farmers who were progressive farmers that owned their own airplane. They could travel to meetings and so forth quicker. They could survey their farms. It was an advantage, and that was started with the farmers under the auspices of Oklahoma A&M College. They had a flight training program, and so that worked out. There were several ways in which we learned about Oklahoma A&M. One event, if you will allow me to tell, and I'm not sure of the details of how this was so fortunate for us, But I was on the high school basketball team, and they allowed us to take, the coach and the team drove the bus to Norman, Oklahoma to watch the Aggie and the OU basketball team play. That was when Bob Curland was a senior. And Joe Bradley, who happened to have gone to Port School for a few years, was a freshman on that team. And we got to view them in playing and defeating OU in basketball. That was Curlin's senior year. And they had won the national championship the year before, and they won that year too. The first time at that time that one college had won back-to-back national championships. And so that was another.
Where did your older brother go to school?
He went to Oklahoma A&M. He didn't serve in specifically in World War II. The war had ended. He stayed on the farm because, having no father, he was kind of the head. He was able to keep us on the farm, and for the war effort, it was important that farms produced. And he didn't like the fact that some of his classmates were beginning to join the Army and so forth, and he couldn't go. But he had a responsibility not to. He had a deferment, so he wasn't drafted. But he wanted to participate, and he did. The war ended, and he volunteered and served in Korea. He was in 18 months, I think, and served in Korea. This wasn't the Korean War. This was occupation forces after World War II. Well, he had the GI Bill, and he was ready to get on with his life. And he and I enrolled in A&M on the same day. Now that was in 1948. I well remember enrollment day because the freshmen enrolled last, all the other classes, and they did it by calling the names. We all sat on the football field west of Gallagher Hall, and we waited until they called the freshman class, because inside Gallagher Hall they had all the departments, and they had all of the courses that were offered, and you had filled out your little trial schedule, and it was your responsibility to personally go to each of those departments and see if they had an enrollment card for you for the class you wanted. And of course, a lot of the classes would be already taken up unless it was strictly a freshman class, and a sophomore didn't need it. So we were last. It was a big scramble. You got in there with your trials program, and you went and said, I want this course. You had it made. I went, oh, well, we can't offer you that course. And you'd say, well, you'd get what you can, and you'd go back and forth, and finally maybe you might have to go to your advisor and say, hey, I can't get in these classes. What else can I take? It was Oh, well, they do that all now by machine with computers and all. But we've sat out there and waited. So my brother and I were freshmen at the same time. But he was ready. He knew what he wanted to do. He wanted to stay in agriculture, and he wanted to get a degree that allowed him to teach vocational agriculture. His mind was made up. And I still kind of fumbling around a little bit. And he actually graduated in 3 years because he went to school. They had, besides the 2 sessions, fall and spring, they had summer school, and they had a short part called August intersession. And he went consistently and took a heavy load. He took, I think, one semester 21 hours. So he finished in 3 years. It took me 5. So on the average, we were 4. But because I changed majors, I changed after my first year.
What did it start? What did your major start out as?
It started out, I was a speech major. I enjoyed dramatics, I enjoyed speech, and that's what I wanted to be. But a lot of that was, the courses I had to take were kind of alien to me. And although Port was a good school, it was tough because the standards were really high. They expected you to do your homework and pass the tests in college, and they didn't allow you any slack or anything like that. They'd just soon flunk you out as have you. And I was kind of a loose wheel at the time, I guess, and didn't study and ended up with some kind of bad grades. And back then, those grades, if you flunked a course, that F continued on your record. You'd have to make, if you took the course over, you'd have to make an A in it, and that only gave you like maybe a C average because it was figured in. So many hours tried and so many hours that you made. And F's were 0. D's were, that was for the number of hours. F was 0 and D's was 1 and so on and so forth. So I ended up first and second year, I think, of 1.9 and a 1.7. And I was on probation. And so I was going to drop out of school. After the first year, I went back for the summer and worked for a fella who had been a farmer in that community. Tommy King was his name, and he and his wife really treated me good. They gave me room and board with them and gave me a certain amount of money, and I was just going to stay down there and work. But my mom and my brother said, "Hey, you need to go to college." And my brother said, "Hey, I'll help you. I've taken some of these courses. I'll let you have the notes and all that." And so I did enroll in agriculture, something I knew something about because I'd grown up in that. And I didn't have any trouble in it. And so that was fortunate. And a lot of stories I could tell you about the difference in the campus and so on and so forth. When a lot of buildings that are here now weren't there. The newest building on the campus and the first yearbook would show it as New Dorm, was what is now Stout Hall. That was the newest building there. Girls went to the junior and senior girls went to the Willard dormitory. Freshmen and sophomores were in North Murray, or in Murray or Stout Hall. And that's everybody, hardly anyone had a automobile. And so if you dated a girl in a dorm, you would walk up to the dormitory and up the stairs and just into the door. They didn't let you go any further than that first little room in the door. And you would say who you had a date with. And they would call her name up the stairway, you know. And if you'd arranged ahead of time, she knew about when you were going to show up, and she'd be there. And so she would come down, and you would walk wherever you wanted to go. A big occasion, say on someone you didn't know very well, you just went on a Coke date, and a Coke then was Coca-Cola, you know. The drug Coke, we didn't know anything about that. But anyway, that was kind of to break the ice. You'd go to a drugstore and have a Coke date. Two prominent places for students to gather, either single or as couples, were swims. It was a campus, they called it a swims campus store. And that building's still here. And then there was Brooks student store, and it was upstairs where the fire station is. That's what we called Campus Corner. And across from the fire station is a big building, a two-story building, and Brooks was upstairs in that building. There was over time, from the time I was there, Swims was really in its heyday just before 1948. But as time went, the crowd slowly shifted to Brooks. Both had a little dance floor, so you could play the jukebox and dance.
Did you enjoy dancing?
I wasn't all that good, and I enjoyed like holding a girl, but I was pretty clumsy. But generally they would look over that, you know what I mean. But that was a lot of fun. I didn't have any lessons to do that. It was just kind of learn as you go. You know, they try to help you. Then they kind of the crowd kind of a student crowd kind of moved to across where there was a drugstore adjacent to the campus theater. When the student union building was built, the students all migrated to it because it was bigger. It had Starlight Terrace, and when it was developed, it was a Starlight Terrace. It wasn't any roof over it. And then there was a migration sometime to what we call the Strip. And so that's been kind of the migration. Girls wore dresses. Boys wore just regular pants. Us poor folks just wore the wash and wear. The fraternity boys might wear dress pants. And of course the sorority girls were always real neat and in very stylish dresses. No shorts, for either boys or girls. Boys could wear shorts, but girls could not be allowed in the library in shorts. They had a code and they stuck by it. Another thing, the only jackets, coats that a student could wear, like an athletic letter jacket, you could wear you had to take your letter off your sport coat. The only letters that could be worn were the O Club, the Oklahoma A&M letter, and they were pretty strict on that code. It was written up in the handbook.
Kind of go back for a second and talk a little bit more about your brother when he went to Chicago.
All right, it was an interesting story. Chicago had had 4-H club members from all over the United States, and some of them didn't know anything about Oklahoma, and they figured Oklahoma. They had always heard of Indians in Oklahoma, and so they would ask him, what about the Indians in Oklahoma? And he said, oh yeah. He said, we have to carry a rifle on our tractor just to keep them fought off. And they didn't know any better. Another thing that he did, which was really funny, was he had collected some seeds of cockleburr. I don't know if you know what cockleburr looks like, but it's a seed that has a lot of spines sticking out of it. He took some in a little sack, and he'd show them to these other students that didn't know anything about Oklahoma and weeds, and he'd say, these are porcupine eggs. They didn't know any difference. They thought, well, that's the way porcupines get started. I thought I had another story to tell.
Pearl Harbor?
Oh, yes. The day that the team, let me back up just a minute. The county agent, the way they made the trip, the county agent drove himself and the team to, I believe, El Reno, where there was a major hub for freight trains. And they took well, maybe not a freight train, but they took a train to Chicago. On the return trip, we were to meet the team back at Cordell, that's the county seat of Ouachita County, at the home of Fred Amon, who was the county agent. This was to take place in the evening. That morning, when we were doing the chores and got back to the house, Mom and I listened on the radio, and we heard a report that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. That was the date, December the 7th, 1941. And Mom was fearful that the team might not make it back. I mean, this was a big event coming on. The Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor, and the country was they didn't know what else would be bombed. And they showed up, of course, without incident. but the county agent had left his car in El Reno, and then they drove back to Cordell.
And how did the team do?
The team won first place, and my brother was high individual. Quite an accomplishment for kids out of Ouachita County and Port School.
Well, we're gonna fast forward back to Oklahoma A&M, where we left off. You were telling me about swims and other places that you would go and dance and have fun. And while you're here at Oklahoma A&M, did you ever find your main squeeze?
Yeah, I decided, I guess you're referring to my wife? Yeah, okay. I met her, we talked about Brooks. She was a part-time waitress in Brooks. She was actually still in high school when I met her, and I met her at Brooks. As a result of I would go up to Brooks on occasion and have a cup of coffee, and she happened to be a waitress that sometimes waited on me, and so one day she served me coffee, and she said, "Would you like sugar?" And I said, "No, just stir it with your finger." And she picked up on that, and then we started dating, and ultimately we got married. And unfortunately, the marriage ended in divorce, but many, many years later.
Were you still a student when you got married?
I was a student. We got married in 1952. And she, at that time, I had a job, a part-time job, and we made it okay. We lived for a little period of time in a small apartment, kind of a garage apartment, at my mom's house, and then later we were able to get into college courts, which was in the area where the hospital, pretty well where the hospital, Stillwater Hospital is now. But it was a series of little small units that were built when the Air Force had some training and some students here at A&M College, and those units for the Air Force people were ultimately turned over to the university and or the college, and they became an extension of the housing. Speaking of housing, a big part of the population of the students were veterans of World War II. And they were anxious to get on with their lives. Many of them were married and had small families, and they were a dedicated group of students. They set the mark for having the best scholastic records of any group on campus. Many of them, not all, but many of them lived in an area which is an area now occupied by married student housing. There was a large area called Vet Village, or Veterans Village, and it was actually a small community or town within the college in Stillwater. They had their own mayor, constable, the person who acted like a policeman. They had they had a gymnasium for recreation, a post office, a fire department, and a commissary. Commissary is got its name from what the military had, but it's like a grocery store. They stocked everything that would be needed for a family. They wouldn't have to actually go off campus, because this was really the edge of the campus.
Would you spend any time at Vet Village?
Did I?
Mm-hmm.
Only the time, well, 2 occasions. One was my brother and his wife. He married, and he qualified then to get housing in Vet Village, and you put your name on a list, and when a vacancy comes up. So he and his wife Melba had a little. His was not the frame, the building, but the little hut or hutments that they called them. And so I would visit them from time to time. The other part of Vet Village that I participated in is they had practice and games played, intramural games, basketball, in Vet Village. Some of our games were played in the Vet Village gymnasium. Other games were played at the Armory, the Stillwater Armory. A few games were played in Gallagher Iba Arena, but very, very few.
We're kind of talking about places on campus where people lived, and I'm curious as to where you lived prior to getting married.
Well, Mother moved from Stillwater after her divorce. She moved to Stillwater because she wanted to help my brother and I go to college. And she thought, well, if she lived there, we could live with her, and we would have room and board. Well, my brother, in the meantime, did marry, and so he was off on his own, actually very quickly after Mom moved to Stillwater. One other story I would like to relate is that the house that Mom had bought, I think probably only cost maybe about $6,000 at the time. It was on North Hester Street, and just a few blocks north of where Gallagher Iba Arena is. She worked as I don't know the title, but not a custodian, but she worked in one of the dormitories.
Was she a house mother?
She was not a house mother. A house mother is an elevated position who does no real work, but is just kind of over the whole group of girls. Hers was in the housekeeping, I guess you would say. The house we had was small. She wanted to add an additional room because she thought she might be able to rent that room out to a student or so. And she did for a period of time, and that helped supplement her income. And she wanted to build a garage, which was a double garage, and I later converted it to one side to the apartment that Sally and I lived in when we were first married. But she hired the fellow who had built the house originally to build the garage and add on the room, and he allowed us to work with him so it didn't cost as much, because if we helped, that was labor that he didn't have to do. Up on top of the room or the garage, we would see across the alley another fellow that would be on top of his house doing some work, putting some shingles down or whatever. We'd wave at him, each day and go about our way. And one day we just met in the alley. And an interesting conversation we had with him. He was a veteran. He had been a Navy pilot during World War II. He related that he got shot down in one of those battles in the Pacific. He said he got shot out on a day that his aircraft carrier, he was flying off of one of those, had been hit, and it later sunk, but it was aflame for 2 or 3 days. He said his word about the situation when he got shot down was the water was full of people. He got picked up by the friendly side, by the U.S. Some got picked up by the Japanese, because the Japanese and Americans had boats within the area picking up survivors. His plan was to work on a house. He bought a lot and built the house himself. He was working on it, and it was almost finished, but not quite. He had a lot of interior work to do. His plan was to build that house, and rather than try to supplement his income by working somewhere else, he had built up a nest egg. He would sell his house when he graduated. I'm not sure what field he was in, and we didn't. I didn't see him very often after I left the mom's house, so I don't know what happened to him. But interestingly, the aircraft carrier he was on was the Hornet, which happened to be the same aircraft carrier that launched the B-25 bombers that hit Japan, the Doolittle raid. The Navy pilot was on that aircraft carrier. See, it served in the war until it was sunk on the day or a few days later after he hit the water.
Well, you also had a little bit of involvement in the military, I guess going back to your Oklahoma A&M days with ROTC. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I had to take all able-bodied males at the time that enrolled at A&M College had to take 2 years of basic ROTC. You didn't have any choice. They furnished a uniform and furnished a rifle and all that, and we went to military classes, and we drilled on Tuesday afternoon. Every Tuesday afternoon, you couldn't take any classes because you had to be free for the military drill, and the drill for the Army part was in the practice field, which was the football practice field, which was east of Gallagher Hall. That field was full of soldiers, and learning how to march and stuff like that, carry a rifle and be in formations, and that whole area was full. They had an Air Force contingent that met over there on the, which was south of the old gymnasium, so they weren't in that group. But it was a very, very large corps. ROTC, that's Reserve Officers Training Corps, and you become a reserve officer. If you complete the course, you become a second lieutenant in the Army Reserve. Your commitment to that, if you take advanced training, which you have to do 2 more years, they issued you a pinks and greens officer uniform. They pay you a little subsistence, which always helps when you're going to college. And I don't remember the amount of money, but it wasn't much, but it was useful. And you were committed to 2 years of active duty service and 4 more years of reserve time, giving you a 6-year obligation. And it was fortunate that, well, the Korean War came on during my sophomore year, and I hadn't planned to take advanced ROTC because I wasn't really all that interested in the military, although as a child, reminiscent on World War II, you know, we played war and all that kind of stuff, but as I grew, I didn't care too much about being in the military. But the Korean War hit, and they began drafting a lot of people. There were some drafted that were college students, and I thought, well, I better. It looks like I'm going to go in the military one way or another, and I thought I'd be better off of going ahead and becoming an officer than I would being an enlisted man. So I took the 2 additional years of training. As a result of the training, you had to, part of the training took place at a 6-week summer camp at the end of your junior year, and that was at Fort Hood, Texas. We had to drive down there, and that training was just like basic training for any enlisted man. We lived in barracks. We cleaned the barracks. We cleaned the latrines. We scrubbed the floors. We did everything. We participated in all kinds of small maneuvers that you'd have to do in the infantry. We had qualification for M1 rifle for the carbine and all of those things. Very rigorous training. The Korean War was on, and when we first got there, the general who was in command of that training told us immediately, he said, "We have been told by the great white father in Washington to whip you boys into fighting men, and we will do it." And the great white father he referred to was the president. And so they trained us. It was rigorous. Well, I got my commission on schedule in 1952, but I was about a year behind for an agriculture degree. But they could have called me to active duty, but they said, no, we will not call you to active duty. We would rather you finish and get your degree. And so you need to make your grades and get your degree. And so I did that. I went on active duty in August the 3rd of 1953. By that time, I already had a son, young son, Michael. The situation was that I didn't have a very good automobile, so I had since I was going to be traveling, going to Fort Benning, Georgia, I went ahead and bought a very modest Plymouth car. The first assignment was to go to what's called Basic Infantry Officers Course. And that's a repeat of everything you've done earlier, plus all of the field maneuvers that are involved. And so then you are branch qualified. I had hoped to get pretty fast into Army aviation. I didn't know anything about flying. I'd only been up in a Piper Cub one time, and that was at Sentinel, Oklahoma, when I saw a airplane flying over it, and it landed in a little sod strip south of Sentinel. So that was my only experience, although I watched a lot of war movies showing aviation and so on and so forth. But I applied for Army flight training. But in the meantime, I was assigned out of Basic Infantry Officers Course to Fort Hood, Texas. Well, that's the place I'd been already in at summer camp, and that wasn't a good place to be. It was hot and dusty, but you go where you have to go. And I was assigned to a armored infantry company and as a platoon leader. And they were in the stage of training. In the Army, you're always training for something. You're always taking some kind of training. And they were at the level where you were acting as a fighting force, and the officers of the platoons and companies did the own instruction of the whole deal. At a lot of when they're training at a lot of these units, they'll have special instructors to teach the various subjects, so that they have, real well qualified in the subject matter. But we had to do that. We had to train all aspects of whatever the company was called to do. I was hesitant, but I still wanted to get into Army aviation. And I was hesitant, but when I met the captain, the CO of the unit, on the first meeting, I told him that I had applied for Army aviation. I didn't want him to think, if my orders came in that, I didn't like the unit and wanted to get out and apply. I told him up front that I had already applied for Army aviation, and he accepted that. He was a West Point officer who had served in Korea. It took, from the time I entered active duty, it took 8 months for me to get into Army aviation. The situation at that point, then was you had to, upon entering flight school, you had to commit to a 3-year service beginning at the time you started the training. So it was, see, it amounted to adding essentially a year onto your two-year service. And it took me 8 months, so I actually served 3 years and 8 months total time. But it was Army aviation. The training was magnificent. We went first to a primary aviation school, which was ground courses, which was engineering, maintenance, weather, flight, theory of flight, all that stuff. At Gary Air Force Base, the Army had a contract with the Air Force to train the Army pilots during the primary stage. And we flew in essentially Piper Cubs. They were more like a Super Cub. They had a bigger engine and so forth. And we learned everything about general flying in those. And we got some instrument training too. Then the second part of the program was the Army tactical phase, which was conducted at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. It was at the time the Army Aviation School, because Army Aviation developed as a part of the artillery, because it furnished a good aerial platform to direct fire for the artillery. And so that's kind of how Army Aviation got started. The Air Force, when the Air Force became a separate unit, see, the old World War II was Army Air Corps, but they split off then the major part of flying into the Air Force. That left Army aviation with just the small airplanes. And as helicopters grew, then that's what mostly Army aviation is helicopters. The training was good. We had short field technique, maximum performance takeoffs, artillery spotting, message drop and pickup, road landings, limited aerial supply by carrying packages under the wings and dropping them. So that's what the Army did at that time. And then later I was able to, you had actually 3 options. Additional schools that you could go to, and I elected to go to helicopter school. The other options was instrument training, and the other one was twin engine. You had to have instrument before you could go into twin engine. But I elected to get into helicopters. So that was kind of a novel deal, and that was another training deal. I never served outside of the United States. Some got to go to Europe or Japan, but they never did to send me. There were at least 2 occasions where orders, I was ordered to go with a unit that would be going to Germany or Japan, and then they'd change the orders and I didn't go. But my greatest assignment was in Colorado, flying in the mountains. I was in a unit called the Mountain Cold Weather Training Command, which was the bulk of the people were instructors to teach soldiers of the U.S. and international soldiers on mountain and cold weather warfare, which included skiing and all that. And we were like in the administrative section or support. And we had 3 Army aircraft. We had a helicopter, a fairly large one by those standards, not large as today, and 2 fixed wing. And we flew in the mountains supporting our unit. And we were called out because we had a helicopter. We were called out on several missions of search and rescue in the local areas to help fight a forest fire in Colorado, to support they had the 50th anniversary in 1956 of the first U.S. monument, which was Devil's Tower. And our unit, because they had expertise in mountain climbing, put on demonstrations of climbing up that peak. That Devil's Tower is actually an old volcano plug that all the ground is eroded away, but it's left this big looking monument sticking up out of the plains. And we spent a week up there. Some of the climbers went up and spent the night, and we delivered food and so forth to them, dropped it to them at night with our helicopter. So I had a great experience in that. And ultimately I went to the University of Georgia to finish my PhD, to start and finish a PhD degree program. And while I was there was something that loomed over in Europe as a result of a disagreement between the Russians and the United States about Berlin, and it looked like war might be coming again, and so they called into active duty some National Guard units and some reserve units. I dropped by the post office on the way to where we lived at the time, and which happened to be like an old, they called it the prefabs, but it was like Veteran Village back here. Stopped by the post office, and I had this letter, you've hereby been ordered to active duty. And it gave me less than 30 days to report. So I dropped out of school. I didn't even have the current uniform. They just switched from the pinks and greens to just the green color. And I took a trip to Maryland, where I was going to be based, and picked up a uniform. I had it tailored to fit. Before we went to Maryland, I stopped by the post office one day, and I had a letter that says, your orders to active duty have been canceled. I'd missed about a month of school, getting ready to go to the Army, and they say my orders are canceled. We had gone to Maryland. We had already rented a house, and they said, but you'll probably receive orders in the near future. And I waited about a week and no orders. So I went to Army headquarters in Atlanta, and the fellow said, he looked at my record and he says, you know, said they made a mistake. They should never have called you into active duty. But if you want to, if you would like to go active duty, we'll send you anywhere in the world you want to go. And I said, thanks, but no thanks. And I was able to get back into college. I missed about a month.
Well, I'm going to stop you there because I want you to jump back, and at some point you go on for a master's degree before your PhD.
Right.
So how did that come about?
Okay. After serving in the Army, my last duty station was at Camp Hale, Colorado. I had built up pretty sufficient helicopter time. My plan was, there was a company, I applied for several jobs, but there weren't many at that time in for helicopters. There was a Rick's helicopter in California, and there was Chicago Helicopter Airlines that shuttled people back and forth between airports. But there was another place down in Lafayette, Louisiana, called Petroleum Helicopters Incorporated, abbreviated PHI. It's now the largest helicopter company in the world, but it was a young company then. Their primary job was to ferry men and equipment to off-coast oil wells in the Gulf. But they also had work spraying banana and coffee trees in Central and South America. And I had communicated with them, and they wanted to interview me. And so after coming back, getting out of the Army, we stopped by here at Stillwater, and I visited with a professor that had been my major advisor, and I'd worked for him as a student when I was in agronomy as an undergraduate. I stopped by to see him and say hello, and he said, hey, if you'd like to pursue a master's degree, he says, I've got an assistantship that you can have. It's a teaching assistantship. And I really hadn't thought about that. But as I thought about it on the way down to Lafayette, I considered that, you know. And so I went and did interview for the job down there, and the fella offered me a job. And he said, I don't recall the pay. It was pretty good. But over in my mind, I was mulling around the idea about, you know, as some of this work's kind of like being an aerial truck driver. You know, you're shuttling stuff back and forth. And I wasn't too excited about spraying banana trees and coffee trees and stuff like that. But I still would have enjoyed that job, but you never know. But back then you couldn't, let's say you got injured either during work or not working, and if you couldn't pass your flight physical, and that's all they needed were mainly pilots, you'd be out of a job. You could have spent a long time there, and you wouldn't, you wouldn't have any retirement. And so in my mind, I thought, I might consider the MS thing. He did offer me the job. I asked him up front, I said, how many pilots are you hiring? He said, well, if 4 good pilots came in today besides you, I'd hire them if they would. So I had that opportunity, but I didn't take it. I went back and got my master's degree here. And from there, I went to Auburn, Alabama, and taught at Auburn University in the agronomy department for a couple of years. I also decided that if I was going to stay in research or teaching, the two areas I liked, I needed to get a PhD degree. And I was interested in botany, plant taxonomy, and plant science in general. And I knew of a fellow who was, and the credentials of the University of Georgia, and so I applied there, and they offered me a teaching fellowship, and so we moved from Auburn to the University of Georgia. At that time, integration had not taken place, and I remember one time when the first blacks enrolled, there was a big demonstration took place. Some of us graduate students had decided, and this, we didn't know what was going on with it, but we were going to take a break, and we said, well, we'll go down to a place and have a beer. And we got in somebody's automobile, and there was a lot of traffic down there because they were demonstrating against no blacks in the University of Georgia. And I remember we rolled up to one side, and it was summertime, and we had the windows down, and there were a load of girls, and we stopped there at a stop sign, and one of the girls says, "Sick 'em." Yeah. Well, we weren't involved in anything like that, but that was before integration really took place.
How long were you at Georgia?
3 years. And I got my degree, and jobs were pretty scarce for the area that I was in. I made a lot of applications. I preferred, after having been in the Southeast, I preferred being west of the Mississippi. I prefer the Plains country. And I just had in mind to move west of the Mississippi. And so that limits I had a good opportunity to work for Glenn Burton, who was the greatest authority on forage grasses in ARS at that time, and he was stationed as a matter of fact, he served on my committee, graduate committee, and he offered me a job he was at Tifton, Georgia, at an experiment station. But I said, no, I want to get wet. He said, well, the Southeast offers a lot of opportunity because we got good rainfall. He was a Nebraska guy himself. He got his, I don't know how this happened, he got his training at Rutgers University. Tremendous fellow, he's deceased now. And I got offered a job at Nacogdoches, Texas, at Stephen F. Austin State College. It's now a university, teaching botany subjects in a biology department. And I taught general botany. All the students there had to take general botany, and general zoology too. And to manage the herbarium, they had a herbarium is a collection of plants, and I managed that, and I had some graduate students there, and I enjoyed that teaching. I really enjoyed. but I like to do research too. And I was able to do some research. They would let and encourage me to do research. They gave me some funding to do research, and one summer they paid my salary during the summers, and I didn't have to teach any courses then. And I could have stayed there and been happy. But I got a phone call from a friend of mine. He happened to be acting department head at the time. It's Jack Harlan, a very eminent fella, and the regular department head was on leave of some kind of meeting. And he called me and he said, "Do you have any interest in a position that the USDA Agriculture Research Service will be establishing at Oklahoma A&M College in the agronomy department in peanut breeding and genetics?" And I said, "Well, I will consider it." And there had been a little dissension about the president, the department head at that time in agronomy. So I got on the phone and called my good friend and mentor, Ralph Matlock, who was my major professor for my master's, and said, "How about?" He said, "Well, it'll be a good job, and things are okay here, you know." And so I interviewed for that and was offered the job, and I took it. And I did it because I wanted to pursue pretty well full-time research.
Did you know a lot about peanuts?
I didn't know anything about peanuts except what I had picked up when I taught at Auburn. As people who teach know, is that you don't know much when you start teaching, and you have to work pretty darn hard to learn it and to stay ahead of the student, because you got to stay ahead of them. And so I had picked up some information about peanuts. They grew a lot of peanuts in Alabama, and so as a matter of that, I knew something about it, but I hadn't been involved in any. The job initially was there was a disease caused by nematodes on peanuts, and my job was to breed for resistance to the northern root knot nematode. And it was a new position. It was cooperative with the agronomy department, but I had nothing. I had no laboratory, I had no equipment, I had nothing. So I had the opportunity, and they helped fund me from, at that time, the people who were in authority, the leaders of these projects, and I was in the group called the oilseed group, and oilseed and peanuts and soybeans and many other things were in there, but peanuts was in that group, and Wallace Bailey was my supervisor. That's your boss, and he was stationed in Maryland at the Ag Research Station, and he would visit me a couple of times a year, and we would meet. We'd have an annual meeting of our peanut group, and I would see him sometimes at some scientific meetings. But what was nice was your boss was, you were out of touch with him, except if you wanted to get a hold, because you could pretty well do things the way you wanted to do it, and he didn't interfere, and he gave you all the support he could. And I developed a big facility here for peanuts. It included 2 big greenhouses at the agronomy farm, and was involved in the development of the ARS laboratory facility here, which I had two labs and an office and another greenhouse and a head house, a seed processing place, and the whole deal.
What does ARS stand for? ARS, what does that stand for?
Agricultural Research Service.
Okay.
It's like there are many services within it. What used to be the Soil Conservation Service is one of them. Forest Service. There's a whole bunch of the Horticultural Service. And their objective is to do research. And see, they have some federal stations of their own, but being at a university is a good situation because you get to interact with the university. I've employed a lot of part-time assistant students looking for a job. If I had the funds and needed help in the laboratory or in the field, and my work involved laboratory work, growth chamber facility work, and field work. And the agronomy furnished me the field space at Fort Cobb and at Perkins. And you got to interact. I handled several students, was major professor for several students. Agronomy, a university didn't have to pay anything for that.